Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Biotech Blueprint and Biotech Capital Compass joint efforts to record a podcast on mRNA again. A lot has happened since we recorded our last episode, and especially in the mRNA sphere. And so we thought we would get together and discuss this again, see where Moderna is headed, how they're doing, and in general, just discuss mRNA. So welcome, Hartash. Thanks for organizing this again. I usually give you credit for organizing it, but I feel like this time you really were on my back to make this happen because I've had some, you know, life happen and yeah. So thanks.
Yeah, Katerina. No, it's a real pleasure. As I've told you, I think that, starting the Biotech Capital Compass and then doing my own advisory work in 2024, but literally like in the second half of 2024, the best thing that happened that year was, you and I meeting online and the kind of like the collaborations we've had. It just feels really intuitive and right. I really enjoy it. And I enjoy our discussions. And then,
Mhm.
I know you kind of just mentioned it. I have been kind of mentioning that we'll be doing something together, Biotech Capital Compass and the Biotech
Yes.
Blueprint. But you've had this small thing called the second baby, so you've been kind of busy, and you're very, a mom who's very. For whom family is very important. So finally, I was able to move up the priority list, thankfully, rightfully so. I was happy to be waiting, in the bottom at the bottom 10 category, and now I'm in the top three. Today I'm number one. And on that note, also I just want to let you know, as I mentioned earlier, I got the collars up because it's a beautiful spring day up here in Brooklyn. We might actually have hit 80. And then also I just happened to see, I might have to see it again, but I happened to see on TV while I was scrolling a week or 2 weeks ago this ad for Grease, a movie that was a little bit before my time, but Olivia Newton-John and John Travolta and their whole thing singing, and they used to have their collars up. So today we're going to do this. I'm going to keep my collars up as a homage to
Mhm.
Grease and Olivia Newton-John and John Travolta and spring and good music and songs and
Awesome.
and mRNA.
Yeah. Well, I feel the same about, our collaborations and our friendship actually that has developed over the past over a year now, which is crazy how time flies. But yes, as you mentioned, I had another baby, which is why I've been a little bit quiet on the more in-depth articles and things on Biotech Blueprint, but I'm back. I feel like it's been 2 months. My baby's 2 months old now, as of yesterday. So I'm back, and I try to do more interesting things for Biotech Blueprint subscribers. But I was also just looking up that the Grease it was shot in 1978, which is insane because I loved that movie as a kid and in the 90s. That's what I watched a lot, which is crazy. I can't believe it's that old.
Yeah,
I feel
it's a great movie. I mean, just a short five
yeah.
minute snippet that I saw, and I got to see it
Well,
again.
you've
It
never
just
seen it?
I know I saw it when I was a kid. It wasn't
Okay.
my thing. Musicals are not my thing, but I
Yeah.
always just admired the singing, the dancing. I mean, Olivia Newton-John just made it look so easy, and John Travolta was just, once in a generation kind of like actor and
Mhm.
singer, and they were, young. I think it was a more innocent period then, also, Katerina, right? So you can see the innocence, in the movie and the vibe and everything. And I think, in our, to put it mildly, troubled times, I think it'll be good that when we get back to that kind of a mindset. I
Mhm.
know, I have no doubt we will. It'll take a little bit of work, but that's another reason why it just came to me, and I was like, today, I just got to give Greece a little credit because it was a different time, a different vibe, and a very beautiful vibe. So,
Mhm.
and the hope is we'll get back there.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So we kind of, as I mentioned, we've been trying to do this for several months, ever since I would say even before I had the baby. So like end of 2025. And the reason for that is because we had our series in mRNA where we discussed mRNA from more of a scientific perspective. And then we talked a lot about respiratory viruses and mRNA against respiratory viruses. And then a little bit about latent viruses right before I think the readout for the
Yes.
CMV vaccine. We published that, and we were pretty confident, I would say, or at least I was, in despite some of the early, not so good preliminary results, I was still pretty confident, but that was a little, it was a failure. They completely abolished that.
And that was a
Moderna.
CMV one, right, Katerina? The
Yeah,
cytomegalovirus. Yeah.
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 And then, thank you. And then, and when we discussed quite a bit, I think, oncology as well, and the neoantigen vaccines in one of our episodes on the mRNA series. And so then a lot has changed since then. So I kind of just wanted to get your perspective, or maybe just summarize what happened in terms of the Q1 earnings for Moderna, and just how they've been doing in 2026 compared to 2025, because they were doing really poorly when we were recording the past few podcasts on mRNA.
Katerina, it's so interesting. I mean, look, cytomegalovirus, when I worked as a sell side analyst at Oppenheimer, and we actually helped Moderna, we were one of the banks that helped on the IPO. It was actually a
Mhm.
fellow analyst of mine called Leah Can. She had the main relationship with Moderna, and then after she left, about a year after the IPO, I took over the stock. But CMV, we were so bullish on it. Like we wrote on it a lot. I know they had a science day completely around CMV, et cetera. Their phase 3 data was really good. So the phase 3 not working out was a little bit of a shock, and maybe that goes to show that the ability of mRNA and the LNPs, in mucosal tissues, the way they work, maybe they just need a different approach for latent viruses, which hang around for a while, right? And that's why they're different from respiratory viruses.
Mhm.
So maybe, I think, and Moderna subsequent to that, I think like dialed down all their Latin virus programs. And then they put more resources into oncology and to a lesser extent, rare diseases and, and other areas. And just today I had the news that Vertex and Moderna are winding down their program on the inhaled mRNA, for 5,000 or so cystic fibrosis patients that don't manufacture any of that protein, the CFTR protein. So they've had their ups and downs. But the one thing I will say before talking about the first quarter, Katerina, just to also just remind the folks listening in, is that since their IPO, the stock's up 200%. It's still outperformed both the IBB and the XBI, right? And they've been able to gain almost, I think it's something like close to 30 billion in revenues from their COVID-19 vaccine, which has never happened for like any company, right? I mean, Merck is just doing like 30 billion with the Keytruda after like almost 7 or 8 years on the market, right? Per year. And I'm talking about total revenues, right, for their COVID-19 vaccines. So the thing is that they have had a few failures, as they should, because that's what biotech, phase 3s work about 50% of the time. So from initial successes that they had in respiratory viruses, COVID-19, it looked like flu, going to be a success. It should get approved. The combo should get approved. But now, some of the other projects are coming down to the mean, right? Not everybody's going to bat in baseball. You don't hit the ball every time, right? You might hit it 3 times in a row, and then after that, you will come down to the mean, right? Which is more like 3 times out of 10. Most really good hitters hit it, right? So in biotech, the mean for phase 3s is 500, and Moderna is probably coming down to that mean, and the stocks kind of reflected that, right? It kind of went up on COVID-19 tremendously to 400 plus, came back down when people realized that revenue, wasn't going to be there, overcorrected down to like the teens and 20s. And now it's back up to 40, 50, which is still 200% above its IPO 10 years later. And not a lot of companies that, biotech that have done their IPO in the last 10 years can say that. In fact, the vast majority of them have gone out of existence.
Yeah.
So I would actually say Moderna's done really well. Now, of course, if you've owned it in the last 5 years, you bought it in 21 and 22, you're sitting on some pretty big losses. You've halved or more, lost 3/4 of your investment. But I think if you're patient with Moderna, it will come back. And then just to your question on first quarter, I think the first quarter generally seasonally tends to be weak for biotech, Katerina. When I look at the first quarter and how they've done, it looks across the board. They did really, really well. They outperformed expectation of revenue on EPS. So that could mean one of two things, right? Ideally, it should mean both the two things, but it could mean one of two things at the very least. One is expectations have come down so much that they're low enough now that they beat it, right? So the easiest way to think about that, I mean, and for people listening, is if you're not a financial expert, is that, it's sort of like, think about if I had a son. I was like this for my father, and I kept on getting C's, right? There were times in my life where I kept on getting C's, and he was very irritated with me. I brought expectations down so much that when I got the B or an A, he was like, all right, great. It's like, you got a B or an A. The thing is, B or A should be expected, if you're a smart person and you got good education and you got backup from your parents and you've got good tutoring, et cetera. So expectations have come down so much from Moderna that they're just happen to be beating them. which is okay, not great. Or the other thing, which is that it's the seasonality, right? It just is a weak quarter, seasonality, and analysts have brought their estimates down. And then the second quarter, we'll really get to see whether, they're doing as well as they should be doing. And they're a vaccine company. So it's really their third and fourth quarter where they tend to do really well with their revenues, right? So
Mhm.
the two things we want to see is expectations have come down enough to a point that they're high enough to be reasonable, not too low, right? Which I think we'll know in the second and third quarters. And then number two, we want to see how they do well, not in a seasonally weak quarter like the first quarter tends to be for all of like biopharma companies. And that's topic for another discussion, but it tends to be seasonally weak. And then, but more in the second and third quarters, which tends to be among the more stronger quarters for biopharma, then we'll see against, better competition, so to speak, if they're going to do well. If they can do both those two things, then, at least commercially, they're starting to look really, really good.
Mhm. And also specifically for Moderna, they're expecting some big readouts in 2026, especially in the oncology area. They're now sort of relying on, right? So we'll see. I think that's going to be really important for them as a company. But we can get to that later.
Yeah.
Maybe we can touch on a little bit the respiratory issue. So we talked about COVID. We talked about their plans to do the flu, COVID, RSV vaccine. They have rolled out Resvia, which is for RSV. I think especially in Europe, it's doing pretty well. Not so much in the United States, but they are now facing, and not just Moderna, but any company that is trying to do mRNA work in the respiratory or infectious diseases, they're facing some regulatory issues, right? And that has been pretty apparent since the February 3rd. I mean, it's been apparent since for a while now,
Right.
but on February 3rd, just to remind our listeners, there were some things that happened where the FDA actually essentially, and this has never happened before, as I understand it, refused to file essentially even look at the results for Moderna's mRNA 1010, which is the seasonal flu vaccine application. So people have been criticizing the FDA, and the main problem with that was that the reason was that they used the wrong control arm for older patients. And they said that instead of high dose, which they should have used, they used the standard flu vaccine. And Moderna said that this was discussed previously at a meeting and approved by the FDA. And so, in other words, it seems like they simply are trying to prevent Moderna from rolling out this vaccine. Then there was a lot of criticism, as I said, and they changed their opinion and said that they're going to basically set a PDUFA goal for August 5th, 2026. And so they're still going to, obviously they're now reviewing the application. And so, yeah, what is your opinion on this? I mean, is it true that has never happened before? And what do you think that this is going to be accepted, rejected, or we're going to see another sort of deflection maybe by the FDA to try to postpone the approval, essentially?
Yeah. Katrina, it's so interesting. Since I've known you and we've talked, right? I think I've said this to you before. I think that if I was still working corporate world as a sell side analyst or as a buy side analyst, and I have no desire to go back to the corporate world, trust me, I'm very happy doing what I'm doing right now. But if I was, I would have loved to hire you because you've actually got really good gut instincts. Moderna has a stock. I know that you and I have talked about it offline also a lot, but you tend to pick up on things and hone in on things that actually are not just important to the business, but important to the stock price also. And that's what, that's where I see the big difference between people when they're looking at biotech is that they can get the business idea right, but they might not get the stock right? They're two different things. And you happen to focus on the things that are important to the stock at that moment. And as you said, that February thing is very, very important. And I'll tell you why. It's not important, I believe, for the August thing. The August thing is going to be important, period, right? If I was, as an analyst, the way I would approach it is that vaccine PDUFAs, once you get to when they've been filed, the BLA, if you actually look at the statistics, right, the historical statistics by the FDA, I think they've got about an 86 or 87% chance of approval. They've been approved historically, right? But because this is mRNA vaccines and because of the FDA and DHSS and, Mr. Kennedy, their issues with mRNA vaccines, then I would not like say it's 86, 87% anymore, I might like bring it down to 80%, right? So meaning like I'm giving a discount, right, to it getting approved. But 80% is still pretty good, right? It's not 70%. It's like a good B, right? So what I would say is that yes, there's a 10 to 20% chance less than
Mhm.
historical that this might not get approved. But that still means that 75%, there's 3 and 4 chance it's going to get approved, right?
Mhm.
So that's the way I would approach it if I was just a pure analyst perspective, right? Now, if I was thinking about it from the from the point of view of like a layperson, then I would think about layer in one other thing, right? Which is, and this is where I think you and I discussions about many things, vaccine related, have been so fortuitous in the sense that it still seems like this administration isn't necessarily vaccine friendly, and
Mhm.
especially is not mRNA vaccine friendly, right? And if in August they don't get approved, even if we bring our, let's say, you and I, we discuss this and we've got a fund that we're running and we put a 75% probability of approval and we buy part of the stock before the approval, thinking that it's still not bad. But if it doesn't get approved, that to me tells me as an investor that the government still has it out for mRNA vaccines.
Mhm.
Vaccines in general and mRNA vaccines in specific, then, companies like Moderna and other mRNA companies or companies who are dependent on mRNA for their, products, that's kind of like a big hurdle, then from an investing perspective, because the government and government's actions are not something you can model. That's a
Mhm.
black box,
Is that right?
right?
Mhm.
So that's the way I would look at that, if from an
Yeah.
analyst perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. No, thanks. Do you think that what is it about the mRNA, or why do you think? I mean, we can only speculate. And I know it has to do with the COVID pandemic and the ways that it was handled potentially. I mean, I live in Utah currently, and we have very low vaccination rates here, and they're really good before the pandemic. And so when you ask people, not that people talk about it a lot, but it seems like the public tends to think that it's the way that the COVID-19 pandemic was handled and how people were made feel that they have no choice and they have to be vaccinated against COVID, and they have to use these vaccines that they believed were new and never used before, and all these conspiracies that were surrounding it. So I think that RFK Jr. and these people potentially have it out, like you said, for mRNA vaccines for that reason. And yet then they say that they will support mRNA vaccine research in oncology, but they don't want to really support the mRNA vaccine research in for respiratory viruses and other viruses.
Yeah. It's a really, really interesting question. Honestly, Katarina, it's one of the best questions that came out of COVID.
Mhm.
It's still a great question today and a great topic for discussion. Um, when we were covering Moderna during the pandemic, we were like very bullish on it. We were probably the most bullish. We kept on upgrading its price target faster, higher and faster than anybody else, from like 22 to like 50, then to like, I think like 80, then like, 150, then like 250. And then finally we're into 400, we brought, back down to a neutral.
Mhm.
And because I really believe that these vaccines would work, because I've worked in clinical drug development before I came to Wall Street. And I know vaccines, once they show good titers, especially respiratory side, then they should work, right? Now, there's always an element of not them working. So
Mhm.
when all this pushback happened all over the world, and for example, a good example is Sweden, they
Mhm.
kind of stayed open, right? And I was actually one of those vaccine ideologues. I was like, oh, everybody should like shut down and et cetera. And then I really spent a lot of time thinking, why did I think like that? And I actually argued with a good friend of mine that Sweden should have shut down also. And we didn't come to any conclusion because he believed what he believed. He was not a medical health professional, but he was more on the creative side. But I respect his opinion and I started thinking deeply about this. And I want to give you some context. So I always believe human beings are rational. I always go to that. There are a few people that are irrational. We'll put them to the side. I think you can figure those people out pretty easily. But it's a vast majority, 99.9% of like human beings are rational. And so if people are rational, ask yourself, why are they doing this, right? And so the first thing that you should realize about vaccines, why are people having such a reaction to vaccines, right? Not oncology vaccines, right? Is just remember, vaccines are given to healthy people to prevent them from getting a disorder, right? So if you're like somebody, who's a bodybuilder or somebody who's outdoorsy, right? And but you still got a day job, and your hospital or your company mandates that you got to get the vaccine, and you rarely feel ill, but you get the vaccine, and then for 2 days you got to call in sick. You're sick as a dog, which hasn't happened in like 2, 3 years. You're going to be like, the vaccine's causing like my problems. And let's say you haven't been sick for a while, right? And then, a month later, 2 months later, you're feeling very drowsy or something, you might think it's long COVID. I do think long COVID maybe is a thing, but you could say, oh, the vaccine made me sick, right? So I think that's one of the things you got to keep always, we have to remind ourselves, vaccines are given to healthy people from stopping them from getting a disease, right? And healthy people are actually very like stubborn and obdurate, right? Like, let's just do a thought experiment, and I'll end with this. Whereas, like sick people, oncology, you give vaccines, they're still sick people. They've got the tumor, so they'll be like, "All right, give it to me. Like, I'm willing to try anything," right? But like, let's just do a thought experiment. Let's just say, for example, that today there was some kind of a disease, and the only way that we could stop this disease is that every human being had to become vegan,
Mm.
like vegan, no dairy, no nothing. Don't you think? And I would seriously, I would be like, you know what? It's all good. I'm willing to give the disease a shot because I'm not going to give up my milk. Hell no, excuse my language on a podcast. But my point is, imagine if we did the same thing. We told everybody that in order to stop this disease, you got to become a vegan. There are people like me who'll actually be really, really not just kind of disconsolate. We'll be like, I'll be pissed, excuse my language. I'll probably keep some milk hidden and drink it, and I'll do things that are non-vegan. So people, I think there was a lot of healthy people that were forced to take vaccines that didn't
Mhm.
necessarily want to take it, just like many people might not want to become vegan if we asked them off it, if that was the only course of action. I think really that's the only reason, honestly. I think there are some people that are maybe conspiracy theorists. I think there's some people that are overly paranoid. And I
Mhm.
think there are people who take advantage of these kinds of things, right? These kinds of people have taken advantage of the vaccine discussions and arguments that have gone on. But I really think the reason is very, very simple. There are many healthy people that just don't want to take something, put something into their body, just to prevent them from getting an illness. They would rather just take their shot out in the real world.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I agree. And I just wish it didn't trickle down to other vaccines as well, especially childhood vaccination, which is something I deal with right now. I think you're 100% right though. It's something that makes sense. It's the healthy versus sick, right? So
Yeah.
then personalized neoantigen vaccines, they're given to people who are sick and are getting treated, right? And so don't have that many options versus
Hey,
forcing someone who is healthy or like a whole population.
yeah.
And I say forcing, but it yeah. And in some cases, I mean, people were losing jobs if they refused to get a vaccine. And so I think that was kind of like fueling the
Yeah.
anger.
Kat- Katerina, but to your point, I mean, I think they're anthropologists. My sister-in-law is an anthropologist, a cultural anthropologist, and they're
Mhm.
anthropologists. I think they're also biologists who study ethics and whatnot, right? They
Mhm.
would argue that there's also an issue of the individual versus societal, right? The thing is that they are diseases where the entire society has to get together to fight it together, right?
Mhm.
So maybe also what happened was we just didn't educate well enough, right, before the pandemic.
Mhm.
Maybe that's another reason, right? That we have to go out there and educate to people that, hey, sometimes like you might not want to have this vaccine, but there's some people out there where if you catch this disease, right, or you catch a flu and you're in the subway, there's some immune compromised people. If you sneeze on them, it might be a death sentence to them, right?
Mhm.
So, like, these are issues that are societal. And so this involves constant communication, right?
Mhm.
Building of trust, like education. And I think probably countries like Japan, people have noticed this, Asian countries tend to be more cohesive. They're not as heterogeneous as the United States. And maybe once we get past this anti-vaccine mood that we have right now, we can have administrations that go back to focusing on education, to focusing on, explaining to society how important it is to have like a group, doing things together as a group in order to protect certain vulnerable members of our population, right? And I
Mhm.
think if we can do that, it'll make our society just stronger, right? And that's where vaccines work. Once you
Mhm.
do have that education and that communication and that trust builds up, it actually makes the society more cohesive and
Mhm.
more trusting of each other, right?
Right. No, that's absolutely true. I think especially when the pandemic hit, we didn't know what was going on in the beginning. Like hindsight's 2020, right? We didn't know how bad COVID was, and so I think that there was a lot of kind of this panic mode on all sides. And it's just unfortunate that we're kind of still dealing with the aftermath of that today in some ways. But that being said, I also agree with you that people have to take some sort of responsibility for others, right? And it's not just immunocompromised people, and there is a lot of them, but it's also children, right? Like I see it every day now. Like I said, I live in a county that has the highest measles counts in the whole country, and it's very frustrating because I have a 2-month-old, and so I can't go out as much as I would like to. I also have a 2-year-old, so I can go to enclosed spaces because I don't want my 2-month-old to get measles, because it can be very detrimental and also have a profound negative effects for their whole lives, especially when they get it so young. And so I exactly know what you're talking about, and it's very frustrating. But I have a hope, and my hope is that when you look at the vaccination rates before the pandemic, they're very high, including in this county, which right now is very. I mean, 87% of kindergartners or pre-K kids have been vaccinated with any childhood vaccination. So that's very, very
Have
low.
not been vaccinated? Have
Have been,
not,
have been. So
have
there's
haven't.
13% have not been vaccinated,
Okay. Okay.
which is it's still way below the herd immunity
Oh, is
threshold.
that pretty low? Wow.
Very low.
Wow.
Mhm.
Wow. I
You-
imagine
you-
probably like here in New York City and Brooklyn, it's probably like maybe like 100%, like
Exactly. Yeah,
99 point something
exactly.
percent, right? And Katerina, you've kept a really, close eye, and a question for me here, on the Moderna and the share price and mRNA. I think it's been close to your heart, the technology. I think when you
Mhm.
graduated from Johns Hopkins, and and many of our discussions, and you're actually pretty passionate about it. You've been always, I think, passionate about Moderna and vaccines and stuff. Like, just in the 2 years that we've known each other, like, do you think 2024 was that when this administration came in, right? And they came
Right.
in, Robert F. Kennedy was made the head of
Yeah.
DHHS.
Was
And
it?
uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
do you
Was
think
it
it's
2025?
gotten worse? It's the same, or it's holding steady?
Right.
Or do you think, what do you think is the temperature right now of this vaccine rhetoric? Even more so than like mRNA, let's say.
Yeah, yeah. I think that it definitely has gotten worse, and I see it just in my circles of people who are educated, who are, nurses, people who have master's degrees in science, even. And when you don't have a consistent and coherent and science-based united front, people who are in power, and that they're not united, they're not cohesive, because what we've been seeing, unfortunately, with RFK Jr. is he flip-flops a lot. Like, so he will say something, he will say, I if my kids were little today, I would never vaccinate them, right?
Yeah.
And
Right.
then when he's pressured by the Senate to say, do you believe in vaccines? He will say, do you think that kids should get vaccinated with the MMR vaccine? He will say, absolutely, like, we support this. So it's a lot of mixed messaging that confuses people. Prime example would be the Tylenol thing. Even though
Right.
for decades we've been told, and we have a lot of good research showing that actually Tylenol is okay to take. I mean, it's small amounts, in reasonable amounts in pregnancy, and when you have a little kid with fever. People get scared because now you have the president, you have the health minister, essentially, the main person that is supposed to be looking after the health of Americans, is telling you that you shouldn't take it because it's going to give your kid autism.
Right.
People get scared, and I have people that are, they actually work in healthcare, they work in research, and they're like, I'm not taking Tylenol anymore because I'm scared. I don't know what's
Wow.
true. And so I think that goes with the vaccines as well. When you have someone who is essentially saying that if he had kids, he wouldn't vaccinate them,
Yeah.
it leaves people with something, right? Bad feeling, at least.
It's really fascinating, Katerina. I asked you that question with a thought in mind, and I'll respond to you first as an analyst, and then second as a person, right? So, as an analyst, what I would say is, actually, your concern tell me that, and this is not investment advice or anything
Sure.
like that.
Yeah.
It's just a podcast, but this would be a signal to me, like, to probably be buying some Moderna if, like, if I'm a long term believer, because, if you're a very astute person and you do observe things very carefully, because of your kids and the county you live in, because of your friends and your family, our discussions, Biotech Blueprint, your Substack, Endeavor, etc. So when you notice this, that tells me that Moderna stock right now probably has a ceiling to it, and that ceiling is capped by these concerns. Other people are also careful not to buy the share price because they're like, oh, this can get cream because the government can, become even nastier towards Moderna or vaccines or mRNA based products, et cetera, right? So, but like, no government is in perpetuity in the United States. I mean, that's the strength of our democracy, right? And this government will change, right? And so when we go back to a government that is more science based, and this government is more something else based, whatever it is, but it did get elected in, and so we have to respect the wishes, of people there. I believe that personally now, but once we get, I think, a science-based administration back in, and where focus on DHSS and CDC and FDA is more science-based, and not to say mistakes are made there. Mistakes are made also in science-based, administrations. Then I think what you're going to see is a tightening up of these rules and more education, et cetera, right? So I think we're going through a cycle, one of those cycles. So as an analyst, to me, this would just tell me that if you're more of a believer in the long run, you'll go back more to a science-based approach of like doing these things. And you should probably be owning stocks like Moderna, right? Because right now they're capped because of concern around what this administration is doing. But once that changes, and it will, and others, a different mindset will come in, and I'm not saying that as in like, Democrat or Republican. I mean, that's just the way that politics tends to happen, right? So that's the analyst. Now, as a person, what I would say is you and I are very different, right? And this is what makes this podcast so interesting. You're a woman, right, who's a mother of 2 kids, your wife, and you're also a working person. You're a PhD. I'm a single guy. I'm probably got a little bit of a Peter Pan complex. I probably haven't really grown up ever. I still get food from my mom. I live like in his 20s or 30s. I never got married, never had kids. So I'm kind of like young at heart, but I've learned a lot through life and maybe have a little bit of wisdom, right? And so you and I are in many ways very diametrically different, right? But yeah, which is what makes for like really, really interesting conversations, right? And so from the personal perspective, for me at least, I would say it's really important for me as a single man who can probably be very selfish and say, I don't need vaccines, right? Because I'm fairly healthy, even in my, my 50s. Robert F. Kennedy, is very healthy. He's in his 70s, right? So I could say, yeah, nobody tells me what to do. But then at the end of the day, if I'm walking around Brooklyn, like I bike now, I never used to wear a helmet when I bike. Now I wear a helmet, Katarina, not because biking in New York City is so slow. You can kind of get away with not wearing a helmet, although you shouldn't. But now I wear it because I see so many parents with their kids in the back, and the helmet on. And I think I'm like a bad influence. So I'm doing it honestly as like respect for them. Right. And
I
of
love
course,
that.
it is good for me too, right? At the end of the day. But like it's the same thing in snowboarding. I started wearing a helmet because I saw a lot as I got older. I saw a lot of younger people who are not wearing helmets, and I was like, if I'm an older person, I got to wear a helmet. Like it's just part of like, so I think that's the other part of it is that I think that if I just wanted to live for myself, and there are people who do that, nothing wrong with that. That's why we live in a democracy, as long as you're not hurting somebody or breaking the law. But I do think vaccines are one of those things where it forces the community to have a conversation, because it doesn't work if the vast majority of people don't get that vaccine, right? Yeah. And so it forces us to talk, right? It forces us to build trust. It forces people to like think about the idea that sometimes you got to do things not for yourself, but for others around you in your community, right? And so I think in a weird way, vaccines, if we approach them correctly, can actually bring people together. Right now, they're tearing people apart. But if we do it the right way, they can actually bring people together through education and awareness, right?
Yeah. Well, I just want to say that I thank you for wearing your helmet now. For one, it's safer for you, and also as a parent, I know that my son is refusing to wear a helmet, and anytime we see someone, an adult or kid without a helmet, it's like he's like, why are they? He's 2.5, but he's like, why are they not wearing a helmet when my mom's telling me like I need to wear a helmet? So thanks. But
no, I never used to, Katarina. I appreciate thank you so much for saying it, because now it's going to force me every time to do it. Yeah, because it's like big, it's heavy, it's like same thing with my snowboarding. But I'm like, no. And once you get used to it, it's actually pretty great. But anyways, but
and I mean, and there's studies that show like. Right. It's so much important.
Yeah.
I even myself without kids, like before having kids, like I would always wear a helmet, but it's not cute, but whatever.
Right.
It's like but I was also gonna say that it's the herd immunity is one thing, right? People, and I actually joined, and this is maybe I'll cut this out, but I joined a few months ago on Facebook this group of people that are anti-vaxxers. Essentially, and like hardcore for the most part.
Right.
And what really scared me was it was the number one anti-vaxxing community on Facebook. And what scared me was that in the first 3 months that I was there, they like tripled in size. They were like 70,000 people, when I joined, and then like 250,000 when I was kicked out. I was eventually exposed, even though I didn't do anything. I wasn't doing anything. I
Right.
was just kind of observing.
Wow.
But what I noticed, and this was kind of when the Tylenol stuff came out and all that, but what I noticed, I just wanted to genuinely see what are the reasons, because I as a scientist, and I've been trained in some ways for so long, right? I kind of struggle to sometimes. I mean, I know the usual arguments against vaccinations, and but I really like get in depth and see what are the reasons, like what are the genuine reasons that people will not vaccinate their kids. Because for one, yes, you're helping others, right? You're protecting that newborn who can get vaccinated. You're protecting that person with the transplanted heart that can get vaccinated, or the vaccines don't work with it for them.
Right.
But also you're protecting your own children, right? I mean, we've eliminated essentially almost so many childhood diseases. You will
Right.
see, childhood mortality was so high before, like even just in this 1950s, like before we had all these vaccines to roll out. It's just something, we could talk about this for a long time, and I'll never understand that. Also, that brings me to, as you mentioned, my previous answer would kind of make you think that maybe Moderna is capped right now. I don't know, to be honest, with this administration. What I've been seeing a lot in just observing in the past few months is that they'll do something or not do something, like refuse to see Moderna's results for the mRNA 1010 vaccine. But then there'll be so much pressure and so much critique that they'll actually completely flip 180. And so they'll actually are now going to review it, and they're reviewing it. So I feel like the data for oncology is so strong, right? And they just reported in January's the 5-year follow-up for their, I forget what the vaccine is. What's it called? This neoantigen vaccine that's given to patients.
Yeah, INT, right? Individualized
Yes, yeah,
neoantigen therapy, right?
exactly.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. And it was so well received, and I think it really bumped up Moderna's price and just outlook and Q1 results and everything. And we are expecting more of these results, I think, for in 2026, in a few months. And so I think that this might sort of override this sentiment and the government sentiment or government outlook on mRNA vaccines. And so I don't know. I don't know if Moderna is capped with this administration. I don't think, maybe with the COVID vaccines, but I think they're still going to be rising with this administration, is my perspective.
I agree, Katerina. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why probably Moderna has done a very smart thing, right? They just said, okay, we're going to deprioritize the Latin viruses. You and I talked about cytomegalovirus not working out, right? I mean, that was like a shock, I think to both of us. They've deprioritized the Latin viruses, kept the respiratory viruses, but focus more on oncology now because you know, people who are against vaccines for healthy people don't really have the same issue with vaccines for people
Mhm.
who actually have a disease, right? In this case, it's cancer, right? So it's a different kind of it's a different issue. And also just remember, Katerina, going back to your point about people who don't believe in vaccines or the anti-vaxxers or whatnot, right? I've always believed, and I've used the term, I call it the tyranny of the healthy, right? I mean, at the
Mhm.
end of the day, if you're a very healthy person, right? And most doctors tend to be healthy. Most people with PhDs tend to be healthy. Most people who went to business school, good business school like I did, tend to be very healthy. We tend to run marathons. We tend to be in
Mhm.
like in high school teams and college teams. We tend to be good in musical instruments, things that take a lot of dedication and passion and discipline, right? And which it requires a lot of health, right?
Mhm.
Good physical and emotional and mental health, right? And so when you have these people and they come into regulatory positions where they're overseeing the development of products for diseases, right? But those diseases and the people with those diseases are not represented in these regulatory bodies, right? The
Mhm.
FDA, the CDC, the DHHS has very few people with major diseases. And so we even see it in the investing community. A lot of investors tend to go towards companies where they have a family member that might have had that disease, right? For example, like oncology. heart disease. A lot of investors invest in company heart disease because they probably had a dad or a mom or a sister or brother who had that problem, right?
Mhm.
Maybe rare diseases, right? So what I call it the tyranny of the healthy, in the sense that, we have to get beyond that as healthy people, right? We have to start thinking, talking more to people with these diseases, encouraging them. And I believe FDA used to do that in previous administration, had a lot more interactions with patient groups and, and people in these, with these, same thing on the vaccine side. But going back to your point, like, from the point of view of like Moderna and whatnot, right? Like, I think first and foremost, aside from the socioeconomic and political concerns that are going on, and what's impacting Moderna is healthy people who don't want to take vaccines, and now with oncology, what's focused more on, like, looking at people that have actually got like a disease, it's called cancer. And so in this case, this vaccine, quote unquote, can help them. You're not seeing much of a pushback, right? And I don't think that will occur because, again, just remember, people feel comfortable with their own sort of type of people, right? So healthy people are going to all bunch together and be like, we don't want vaccines. But people who have cancer, who have maybe a few weeks, months, or a couple of years to live, are going to be like, hey, I'm willing to try anything, right?
Yeah.
So, and healthy people might say, okay, if that's what you want, that's what we'll give you, right? But the
Mhm.
point here again is, again, it's that, I call it like education awareness. Like we've got to really, really, I hate to use a business school terminology here, but they always used to say in business school that I think it was a term that, a chain link fence, or a chain, is only as strong as its weakest link.
Mhm.
And that's true about society. It's true about any kind of like society, right? Is that at the end of the day, we're only as strong as the weakest among us, right?
Mhm.
And so if we can't go the extra yard to try to, protect them or help them, then
Yeah, and I'm also hoping that we talked about this a little bit before, is that it's a platform for Moderna, right? I'm just crossing my fingers that it really plays out for Moderna and just for all the patients that they're treating, and not just because of cancer. I
right.
think that having a big win in oncology is going to just open doors for other diseases that they might eventually make mRNA vaccines against. So fingers crossed for.
I'll answer that again as an analyst. It's a really, really good point, Katarina. I mean, think about it, right? So they've got about 2 billion in revenues, right? They've got
Mhm.
like their OPEX, operating expenditures, are something like, I think, something between 4 and 5 billion, right? So yeah, roughly, about between 4 and 5 billion, and that includes cost of goods sold. So like, if you think about that, you got 2 billion in revenues, 45 billion in like operating expenditures, you're -3 already, right? You've got a good balance sheet. But if INT doesn't work out, they'll probably have to massively like downsize the company, right? Because like they need, the revenues of things other than respiratory, right, to work in order for them to support that big cost base that they have, up there in Boston, which is very cool, everything that they're doing. So that's the answer. That's why I hope it actually works, knock on wood. It's really, really important for the company. And then number two, to your point of view, like oncology, like, the INT approach is really cool, Katarina. So one of the things I think you and I talked about this at the last podcast, I think you'll remember this, is that they're using like very enhanced machine learning and now like integrating like artificial intelligence like algorithms to come up with these, neoantigen mixtures for each patient, right? Up to 34 in INT, and they'll increase that, as they go for other tumor types. INT was originally non-small cell lung cancer. And one of the things that they said was that the FDA wants the algorithm also submitted as
Mhm.
part of the package. So think about it, right? Imagine if you're like you typed up on a Word document and PowerPoint slides your presentation and you're sending it to the FDA to get a product improved, but FDA said, oh, by the way, we want the PowerPoint and the Word document like app that you used also, right, to construct this Word document, right? Machine learning, artificial, like these are getting like actual regulatory like thumbs up now,
Mhm.
right? Which is very, very important because, in our industry, and this is conversation for another podcast, which is why I think artificial intelligence and machine learning and all these will be so big, in biopharma and healthcare in general, is because once the regulatory folks start demanding it, then the robustness of these tools have to be much higher. And so you've got a lot more people working there,
Mhm.
to create and make these tools robust,
Mhm.
right? And that's another thing that's coming out of mRNA and Moderna is like they're the company that's pioneering these like machine learning tools and artificial intelligence approach to software to help them with choosing the neoantigens that go into each INT for each patient, which is individualized therapy, right? That's actually really cool.
Yeah, it is. I sometimes on LinkedIn see the jobs that they're posting, and they're really heavily invested in this technology side of science, I guess now you can say.
Yeah. Well, they're doubling down on it simply because they know that they can actually create like a moat around it,
Mhm,
right? If they're a company that's invested a lot of money in computer hardware and software,
mhm,
right? And other companies aren't there, other companies are having to partner with external firms, Lilly with
mhm,
NVIDIA, like, Gilead with, I forget who, or I think maybe it's NVIDIA too. And then
mhm,
AstraZeneca with some company in the UK and
mhm,
China, et cetera. So whereas like Moderna spent literally hundreds of millions of dollars over the last 5 years on this technology to help them because they needed it, right, in order to create their INT mixtures for each patient,
mhm,
individualized neoantigen therapy, identify these neoantigens for each patient. Like that actually becomes a huge moat because if INT is successful in phase 3, right, and they get it approved, like a company is not only gonna, the only way they can develop their own version of an INT is they've got to develop the same software,
mhm,
machine learning and like, artificial intelligence tool that Moderna has taken 4 or 5 years to develop,
mhm,
right? And it's not something that, NVIDIA or, Chat GPT or anything can do because they're focused on the mass market and on the corporate market, right? Moderna's done this for themselves, even though they have a partnership with
yeah,
OpenAI, right? So to me, it's kind of like really, really cool if INT works. I think we'll see like another huge like topic of discussion around machine learning and AI as how it's helping with these individualized therapies, for patients and helping them hopefully live a lot
mhm,
longer. Right?
absolutely.
But I do think, at the end of the day, like there are some technical challenges, that Moderna has had to work around, right? I mean, look, antibodies only work in certain areas, they don't work everywhere.
Mhm,
Small molecules only work in certain areas, they don't work everywhere. Like, things that don't cross the blood-brain barrier don't work, period, in the
mhm,
brain,
mhm,
right? So, like mRNA, like that's one of the things that Moderna is having to go through right now, is figure out, where is it really that the mRNA modality can
mhm,
work, right? And that takes a lot of time and effort from companies. It's not
yeah,
easy. I think because it worked for them in COVID-19 and they had all this cash that they went after a lot of different disease areas, right? Rare diseases, oncology, Latin viruses, heart disease, et cetera. And now they're having to become a lot more
mhm,
realistic. In the next 2, 3 years, really, the pedal is going to be to the metal
mhm,
because they're burning through their cash reserves, to get to
mhm,
profitability, right? And so it's very, very important that some of these projects, especially oncology,
mhm,
work.
yeah. To summarize,
Right.
we talk a lot about how Moderna's been doing really well in 2026, and that's all because they're heavily leaning on the oncology pipeline right now, and we'll see some more important updates in this year in 2026. And then they're also focusing on other things like making mRNA vaccine against norovirus and also still some respiratory viruses. But as you said, that's kind of more of the side burner right now. We discussed oncology a little bit, and perhaps, like I said, we could do a follow-up podcast on that because we're at about
Yeah.
time right now. We discussed the political and geopolitical issues that we have right now, and maybe some of these companies are facing and science is facing in some ways. And then we can maybe continue with mRNA. I'm down. I still have quite a few things that I maybe want to discuss on this topic, but we could also do another podcast on CRISPR. There's some news coming out.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
We wrote, as you know, like, I wrote something on
Yeah.
CRISPR. So absolutely, I've gotten a little bit more thoughtful on it. Like, absolutely, Katerina, like that's like cool stuff. I was not a big believer in CRISPR, but I think like enough work has gone into it now that it's pretty like robust.
Exactly. So, I mean, we could discuss that in the next podcast that we do potentially. Um, I in last this week in biotech in number 98, I was talking about Intelia Therapeutics, and they just had a really good phase 3 result. With
Right.
their drug for hereditary angioedema is actually
Right.
one of the first in vivo CRISPR therapy that had really good readout in phase 3. So, so it's actually the CRISPR that goes straight into the body. It's none of the lab step when they take person cells and they edit them in the
Right.
lab is completely omit it. So
Wow. So it's in vivo, right? As opposed to ex
yeah.
vivo.
hmm
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, we
Cool,
could
cool,
do
cool.
that. But we can also ask, if anyone has anything they would like to discuss on a podcast, like our subscribers. I sometimes get people actually, here and there, occasionally people message me and say you should cover this company. But if there are any topics that people are interested in, we could do that too.
Yeah, no, I really think that the 2, 3 areas where we could like really kind of like have a really fruitful collaboration going forward, at least for the next 6 to 12
hmm
months, I think absolutely Moderna, because
hmm
mRNA, right? And by default, Moderna. Like the biotech mRNA assets, if you remember, like have been pulled
hmm
out. The founders left, right? The co-founders, and they've taken all the mRNA assets and they're going to form like a pure play, like
hmm
mRNA company, probably like private, and then bring it
hmm
out, do an IPO somewhere down the line. So these will be the two most foremost companies,
hmm
right? And then the other one is CRISPR, absolutely very important. Gene editing is something. It's really really something cool, and it's going to make even more and more of a impact, I believe, in the medical world. And then lastly, AI. Like, I mean, AI has been such a big topic that you can almost starting to see the backlash happen in biotech because people are like, how's it really helping? Because it's only
Yeah.
helping in 1 or 2 very minor areas. And so I think it'll be incumbent upon us to like highlight the areas where it's actually working other than just like drug design,
Yeah.
right? And maybe like, clinical data,
hmm
like collection and
Yeah.
validation,
hmm
right? Like this Moderna like machine learning like tool and
hmm
whatnot, like to highlight 2, 3 examples of like where machine learning and AI, or at least large language models and variations thereof off these. I don't like to use the term AI. It's really LLMs. They're
Right.
large language
Yeah.
models. So use machine learning and large language models and the variations of large language models that also work with images and
hmm
whatnot. How are they helping?
Yeah. Yeah. Why don't we do that?
In biotech companies, that actually could be really, really,
Yeah.
I think, a good
What we
topic.
could do is maybe next time then, why don't we do kind of finish our thoughts on, or not finish our thoughts,
Right,
because like you said, there's going to be more things coming up in the future, but we can kind of finish our
right.
thoughts that we wanted to discuss in this podcast on
Yeah,
Moderna and oncology and what is going on in that sector. And then we can kind of transition into the AI stuff, but less, broad talk, but more actually picking successes of
yeah,
LLMs and ML models in
yeah,
biotech. And
yeah.
there's every conference now, everyone is really, talking about what's behind the buzz. And I think we could maybe call it the episode that sort of the
Yeah. No, Katerina.
data.
And also, I really enjoyed, I'll tell you what, one of the things that most people don't understand about me, and I think you actually get it intuitively, because actually you have it yourself too. I think you and I are very alike in this ways. We come across as actually pretty like friendly and easygoing people. We both actually have a very deep skeptical
Mhm,
streak. Like there have been issues that you're very skeptical about, and because you're, a very nice and friendly person, it doesn't come across unless you actually voice it. And when you voice it, then it sounds a little like off because you're a very friendly person, but there's something you're skeptical about. And so, I started this series called The Skeptical Lens on like, in Biotech Capital Compass to cater to that. But I'm also very, very skeptical about things, right? And so like I decided with the Biotech Capital Compass that I'm not going to write like negative things on companies or things, but I'm going to use my
mhm,
skeptical lens to essentially like pick out things that we could be doing
mhm,
better. So don't say what's wrong, but what could we be doing
mhm,
better? Because that's one thing I struggle with. Because there are times where I get very dark and moody. I usually try to avoid people in those
mhm.
moments. And one of my favorite drinks used to be when I used to drink, it was called the Dark and Stormy. And I actually think if I had like my a drink that represented me, it'd probably be that. It's a rum-based drink, but the Dark and Stormy. Like I get those moods. And so it's interesting because I think that's our
Mhm,
collaboration. Is we both have a skeptical kind of a side to it, but we can use it to curate
mhm,
topics that actually are higher
mhm.
value,
Yeah,
right? And not just
I like that.
everything, right? That's how we use our skeptical kind of like side to us, our skeptical lens, is to hone down like on those
Mhm.
focus on those topics that we think, are more viable or legitimate than others. And so
Yeah.
therefore,
And I think
you know,
exactly, like AI is
yeah,
one of those topics, right? Like
right,
I go back and
right,
forth a lot. I feel like sometimes I'm pretty confident that this is going to transform the whole field, and other
right,
times I'm like, well, this is still early, very early. We're
right,
getting ahead of ourselves at times.
right,
And so we'll
right.
see. Let's discuss it. Let's do a little bit more of a research on this topic, and then we can I think that would be a really interesting podcast.
Yeah, I'm game whenever
All
you
right.
are,
Okay.
you know?
So yeah, thanks
So,
everyone.
yeah,
Thanks.
I'm
Yeah.
looking forward to it. All
Thank
right.
you, Hardash, for again organizing this, and thanks to everyone who listened this far. Um, and yeah, we'll be back.
Thank you, Katarina. Thank you, and my best to
Okay.
everybody.
Thanks.
All right. Take care.